Well, now more than ever, the people in general are concerned about the times we live in. And many are even beginning to wonder if they'll survive this current global situation. While others are asking a more sobering question. And some want to know, is this the end of the world as we know it? Of course, predictions about the end are not new. As an example, one writer, a 20th century poet named T.S. Eliot, made this prediction. He said, "This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper." But do you think Mr. Eliot really knew and could prove that he was living in the last days? Or what about the observations of the well-known physicist Stephen Hawking, who likewise made a prediction? He foretold that if the world is in chaos, politically, socially, environmentally, as the world is today, and Mr. Hawking predicted the human race couldn't possibly last much longer. But do you think Mr. Hawking really knew and could prove that he was living in the last days? Well, the answer is that these men, and many like them, don't have a clue. They have no idea where we're at in the stream of time, let alone our Creator's overall purpose for humankind. So the next question is, do we? Do we know? Can we prove that the end of this system of things is rapidly approaching? And more importantly, will we be a survivor of it? In the first century of our common era, Jesus warned about the end of a system of things. He warned specifically and firstly about the end of the Jewish system of things. And if we look back on some of what he said, we can learn a great deal from those who recognized the last days of that system and what they did to be a survivor of it. With that objective in mind, then, we'd invite you to take your Bibles and open up to Matthew chapter 24. Now, as you're turning to Matthew chapter 24, let's just recall the timing and the setting of a conversation that we're going to read about. We'll recall that this is the final week of Jesus' life. The year is 33 CE. To be more specific, it's Tuesday, Nisan 11. And while Jesus' ministry has been very busy over the past 3.5 years, this Tuesday would prove to be one of his busiest days so far. He's been staying most recently with his good friends in the home of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. And he's walking back and forth from their home in Bethany and traveling back and forth to Jerusalem to teach at the temple each day. But where we pick up in Matthew 24 and verse 1, Jesus has just completed his ministry at the temple. He will not return. He will not teach there again. So it's about midday. And notice in verse 1 an interchange that begins between he and his disciples. Matthew 24, verse 1. And now as Jesus was departing from the temple, his disciples approached to show him the buildings of the temple. That's a fascinating detail. His disciples, the apostles in particular, approach Jesus to show him the temple and the related structures. Why would they do that? It wasn't as if Jesus had never seen the temple before. He'd seen it numerous times during the annual festivals throughout his life here on earth. And for that matter, he'd seen the temple long before any of the apostles ever had from his pre-human vantage point. But yet they take Jesus and they point out the temple. Why? Because they're so impressed by it. They're awestruck. It's so grand. It's so magnificent. And remember who the apostles were. They were country folk. They didn't live in the big city of Jerusalem. So every time they traveled to Jerusalem, they were impressed by what they saw. They were so excited to be there in the big city, to be at the center of pure worship, that we can even imagine if they had the same technology as we do, if they had cameras with phones, they would have been taking selfies with the temple in the background. They were just that awestruck by it. So here they are, they're directing Jesus' attention to the temple. How does Jesus respond? Well, notice verse 2. because his response arrests the apostles' attention. Verse 2, in response, Jesus said to them, his disciples, along with the apostles, "Do you not see all these things? Truly, I say to you, by no means will a stone be left here upon a stone and not be thrown down." Now, we can imagine they would have tried to absorb that statement. And they're listening, they're hanging on Jesus' every word. And they look at Jesus and they look at the temple. And his statement confuses them, because everything they see with their eyes looks so permanent. And they knew it was God's house. They felt it would last forever. And they knew a little bit about the construction of the temple. They knew that some of its stones, making up its foundation, weighed hundreds of tons, measuring some 35 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 10 feet high. It took 3 men linking their arms together just to encircle one of the pillars in Solomon's colonnade as they made their way through to a courtyard. But even though they're confused, they don't address it with Jesus at this moment. And so after this brief interchange, Jesus and his apostles leave the Temple Mount. They descend into the Kidron Valley, and then they start their ascent up out of the valley. They walk up through the Garden of Gethsemane. They climb up to the top of the Mount of Olives. And from there, as a group, they're now looking down on the Temple Mount. And after a short period of time, 4 of Jesus' apostles approach him. And they're very concerned. Do you remember the 4? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They're concerned about what Jesus has just stated, along with some other statements he's made in the past few days. And so notice the sincere question that they ask him, because they want to be ready. They want to be survivors. Verse 3, still in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples approached him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your presence and of the conclusion of the system of things?" They ask Jesus a multifaceted question, and he gives them a multifaceted, rather lengthy response. Now, that takes up the rest of Matthew chapter 24 and all of Matthew 25. But in his response, he answers every detail of their question. And then as the years go by, the apostles begin to observe the fulfillment of Jesus' words. But look back at their question and consider what he said next, because paying attention to what Jesus said at this very moment is what allowed obedient Christians to survive the last days of that Jewish system of things. It was only because of what Jesus said in answer to this question that Christians who were alive 37 years later, in 70 CE, are not caught unaware. So if his response helped them to be a survivor of their last days, let's examine a few of the key texts with the same goal in mind: surviving the last days that we find ourselves in. So they ask the question, and Jesus begins his response. Verses 4 and 5, he starts out this way. In answer, Jesus said to them, "Look out that nobody misleads you. For many will come on the basis of my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many." According to the Jewish historian Josephus, it appears that before the end of that system, before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, just as Jesus foretold, a number of false messiahs, a number of false Christs arose, every one of them with a political agenda, all of them promising relief from Roman domination, so they could check that box. But Jesus' reply to their multifaceted question was a compound or composite response. There wouldn't be just one event for them to look for to identify the last days. It would be several events happening simultaneously. So what else should they be on the watch for that would indicate they were living in the last days? Well, let's keep reading. Verse 6. Verse 6, Jesus tells them, "You are going to hear of wars and reports of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be food shortages and earthquakes in one place after another. All these things are a beginning of pangs of distress. Jesus is letting his disciples know that the time period leading up to the end, to the complete destruction of Jerusalem, would be marked by these events and more. Now just put yourself in the position initially of those four apostles. What was going through their mind as Jesus was outlining events that would occur in their near future? And for that matter, the first time we read this prophecy, what was going through our mind? See, we, like Jesus' apostles, might have wondered, how could anyone survive these type of events that would grow in frequency and intensity? How could anyone be a survivor of the last days? What would it take? Well, in a word, obedience. To be a survivor of the end of that system, to survive those last days, Jesus' followers would need to obediently follow direction. And they would need to take action. Well, what action? Drop down to verse 15. Because in verse 15, Jesus identifies yet another event that would not only be a sign of the last days, but would indicate they were getting near the end of that system of things. And not only does he give them an additional event to look for, he tells them what action they need to obediently take. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 15, this is what they're to be on the watch for. Therefore, when you catch sight of the disgusting thing that causes desolation, as spoken about by Daniel the prophet, standing in a holy place, let the reader use discernment. So there's the event. Verse 16, the action. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Or as the parallel account in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20 puts it, that Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, then know that the desolating of her has drawn near. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Now let's pause here and recap for a moment. I mean, here we are reading in the Bible book of Matthew. This is the very first inspired letter in the Christian Greek scriptures. It was written in 41 CE. And what's it all about? It's all about the last days. Why? Because the congregation back then was also facing a time of the end. And all these things that Jesus has just described were happening. They were eyewitnesses of national conflicts. They were experiencing the negative impact of huge famines, great earthquakes, and yes, there were pestilences, pandemics, big epidemic in Rome in 61 CE. Everything that Jesus described is coming true during the last days of that Jewish system between 33 CE and 70 CE. And every time a Christian would hear a news report or be an eyewitness of one of these events, every time they connected it and they remembered Jesus' words, what would they start doing? The same thing we do today. They'd start speculating. They're looking for that disgusting thing, those encamped armies that were mentioned in verse 15. Why? So that they can obediently take action, so they can begin fleeing to the mountains. Jesus clearly identified the last days of that system, but what made it challenging for those first century brothers and sisters was decades began to pass. Things began to go from bad to worse. Until in 61 CE, that Jehovah inspires the Apostle Paul to write from Rome, where he's at, to Hebrew Christians in Jerusalem. Why? Because they're having difficulty enduring. They need encouragement. They're experiencing persecution. They're getting distracted. And the timing of that letter was good, because over the next 5 years, from 61 to 66, things just continue to deteriorate. Until finally, in 66 CE, a corrupt Roman governor named Florus, who's been extorting money from the Jews for years now, Governor Florus gets greedy. And he claims that the Jews owe him a large amount of money in back taxes. And without any type of negotiation, without waiting for any response, Florus simply sends a garrison of soldiers to Jerusalem, to the temple, and they go in and they seize 17 talents in back taxes. Now, when he does that, the Jews go wild. Jewish rebels swarm into Jerusalem and slaughter the Roman forces there. They actually declare war. Judea and Rome are now at war. The fuse has been lit, and all of this is leading up to the initial fulfillment of Matthew 24:15 and the parallel in Luke 21:20. Because within 3 months of that very event is when Cestius Gallus marches into Judea with 30,000 troops in tow. And he only has one mission: crush this rebellion. Now, that's his objective. And he's poised to do that. Coincidentally, his army arrives during the Festival of Booths. So Judea and Jerusalem in particular is at maximum capacity. But within days of his arrival, things happen fast. Roman soldiers actually begin to undermine the temple wall. And the Jews are horrified because pagan soldiers are now defiling Judaism's holiest site. The disgusting thing is soon going to be standing in their holy place. And Christians are recalling Jesus' words. When you see this happen, take action, be obedient, start fleeing to the mountains. And this time, this is the real deal. There is no more speculating. How long was Cestius Gallus and his Roman soldiers there? Now you can imagine the first day of the siege. Then a second day goes by, and by day 2, and supplies are getting cut off, you might be wondering and thinking to yourself, hey, I have to get out of here. I have to flee right now. But at that critical moment, in the heat of the situation, what would the body of older men say? What direction would be received from the channel that Jehovah is using to help his people survive? What would they say? In short, what would the governing body say? Well, at that critical moment, they'd say, wait, don't go now. To go now would be suicide. Plus, those taking the lead have full confidence in the rest of the prophecy that those days would be cut short on account of the chosen ones. So the governing body says, wait. But then the third day goes by. The fourth day goes by. They're there for 5 days. This is the longest week of your life. And then on day 6, they actually undermine the temple wall. And the governing body says, wait. But now by this point, maybe you're thinking independently, maybe even as an independent family head, yeah, but Jesus said to flee. But at this point, to be direct, it really doesn't matter what we think as an independent thinker, because if we're going to be survivors, there's only one game in town. There's only one channel that Jehovah's using to get his people to safety. That's the governing body. And if they were going to survive the last days of that system of things, they needed to be in the habit of listening to and obediently cooperating with direction provided by that channel, the governing body. Now, we look back in history and we have the benefit of looking in our rearview mirror. What happened in this intense moment? Well, all of a sudden, and for no apparent reason, the Romans retreated. And once the Romans pulled away, there was a window of opportunity. Obedient Christians could now begin fleeing to the mountains. And that was key to their survival. They survived the last days of that system of things because they listened and obeyed. And so the question to each of us, what about me? Am I willing to listen to and wait on the governing body today? Because right now we love to speculate. We want to figure it all out. COVID-19, global pandemic, is this the end? But when it comes, when the end comes, it will look like there's absolutely no way out. It'll look like we're trapped behind the walls in Jerusalem with the Roman army encamped around us. And if it didn't look that way, it wouldn't follow the pattern. That's why we know that obedience is the key. And that's why we can conclude that our obedience perhaps now or in the near future, may be tested. We look back, though, on this historical account, and there are numerous textbooks that have been written discussing why the Romans pulled away in 66 CE. And every one of these textbooks ends the same way. It doesn't matter who was the author of it. It doesn't matter if a military strategist, an analyst, a historian wrote the textbook. They all conclude that nobody knows why the Romans pulled away. But we do. Jehovah did it on account of the chosen ones. Those who survived the tribulation that came just a few years later in 70 CE, they did so because they were already in the habit of listening to and obediently following the direction of the governing body. Now, for us today, just what form our flight might take in the future, all of that remains to be seen. We don't know if we'll be told to go to the basement, to the attic, or to shelter in place. We don't know any of that. But what we do know, to survive the coming great tribulation, we need to be in the habit of listening to and obeying the direction of the governing body, not just in the future at some critical moment, but that needs to be our pattern of life right now. Because the truth of the matter is, when it came to our first century brothers and sisters, while faithful disciples took action and survived, Jesus foretold that not everyone who was aware of this prophecy would. Turn to Luke 19 and notice his prophetic comment on that. Luke 19, beginning in verse 43. And as you turn to Luke 19 and we start with verse 43, keep in mind, we're no longer talking about the events in 66 CE. But no, now we're upon the end of that Jewish system of things. Jesus is talking about what would happen right at the end. Here's what he foretold. Luke 19, verse 43. Because the days will come upon you when your enemies will build around you a fortification of pointed stakes and will encircle you and besiege you from every side. That is precisely what happened down to the detail when General Titus arrived in 70 CE. Within a matter of a few days, his soldiers not only camped around Jerusalem this time, but they built a literal wall, a fortification of pointed stakes, and now escape was impossible. So what would it have been like if you were a Christian in the first century who didn't obediently follow direction, who didn't seize the window of opportunity to flee to the mountains? What would have happened if you were still in Jerusalem, trapped behind the walls in 70 CE when Titus was on the scene? Well, Jesus foretold what it would be like. Look at the next verse, verse 44. And they will dash you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave a stone upon a stone in you, because you did not discern the time of your being inspected. Regrettably, many who heard Jesus' words, who were aware of this prophecy, lost their lives because they didn't put the pieces together, because they didn't obediently follow direction. Now, what's all of that tell us up to this point? Well, we can look back in history, and history proves, and we can prove by means of history, that Matthew 24 had an initial fulfillment during the last days of that Jewish system of things, between 33 and 70 CE. But as we look back in history, especially our modern day history, it proves something else. We can see tangible evidence that Jesus' prophecy is seeing a greater global fulfillment right now in our day. As Jehovah's people, we're very familiar with this prophecy, in which Jesus clearly describes events that are leading up to the end of this system. And things like we just read about. We see wars, we see famine, earthquakes, violence, and yes, we see pestilence, we see pandemics, COVID-19. And yet when we present this evidence to others, there are still skeptics. Some have doubts, and some will even argue. And they'll say, as we point to these things as an indicator of where we're at in the stream of time, they will argue and say, well, mankind has experienced these things forever, since humans were created. But we look at the evidence and we know that this period, this time of the end, is unique. Because all these things that Jesus mentioned are occurring at the same time with growing scope and intensity. So for any that we come across who are maybe skeptical, or for those who have lingering doubts about where we are in the stream of time, maybe we can illustrate it this way. Just set the prophecy aside for a moment and just imagine that right now, at this particular instance, you have a severe headache. And while it's bringing you great discomfort, you're not overly consumed by it. You're not overly worried by the severity of the headache because you've had bad headaches in the past and you always recover. Or instead of a severe headache, let's say that right now you're experiencing chest pains. But even at that, you're not overly consumed because you've experienced that in the past and it's never brought you any lasting harm. Or one more. Let's say that you're experiencing that unpleasant feeling of being nauseous right now. And as unpleasant as it is, you don't like the experience. You felt that in the past, but it too eventually goes away. But now for just a moment, imagine that you have all three of those symptoms at once. That you're experiencing a severe headache, chest pains, and you're feeling nauseous. You have all three of those symptoms at the exact same moment. And we're experiencing them at 100 times the intensity that we normally do. Now would we be concerned? Now would we be trying to get help? Absolutely. Why? Because all of those symptoms combined would be evidence that something serious was happening. And that's exactly what happens during these last days. All these things that Jesus described occur at once with growing scope and magnitude, and they serve to prove one simple thing: the end is near. Both the Bible and history provide evidence that the major fulfillment of Matthew 24 is occurring right now. But Jehovah, being the loving God that he is, he wants his people to be informed. So he not only provided by means of his son Christ Jesus events that we could look for that would indicate that we were living in the last days, but he used other faithful servants to pen his thoughts regarding the attitudes that would also demonstrate and prove that we were living in the last days. So we look at all these events and we can check the boxes. What attitudes would be prevalent that would tell us where we are in the stream of time? Turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. And as you just skim the opening verse, verse 1, and Jehovah starts this prophecy with an emphatic statement. He tells us, but know this, that the last days it would be critical times, hard to deal with. He says, know this. That means, that's his approval, his guarantee that what he says next is going to come true. So what attitudes would we expect? What attitudes would prevail among mankind today? Well, look at the long list starting in verse 2. And men would be lovers of themselves. Check, we see that. Lovers of money, boastful, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, disloyal, having no natural affection, not open to any agreement, slanderers, without self-control, fierce, without love of goodness, betrayers, headstrong, puffed up with pride, lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God. Now, in our current situation, one trip out for essential supplies, and we're likely to encounter the majority, if not all of these attitudes on just a single trip. That these last days are critical. We know that they're hard to deal with. But that's the beauty of verse 1. Jehovah does tell us the last days would be hard to deal with, but he does not say that they would be impossible to deal with. We can survive the last days. How? Well, by means of Jehovah's help, through his Holy Spirit, through our congregated family, we can be survivors. But if we're going to survive, it'll take the same thing that it took of our first century brothers and sisters. We need to obediently take action. Of course, when it comes to action, we've been somewhat confined. We've been on restricted movement, no more public ministry currently. So what could we be doing right now during this unique period of time? We know we're deep in the last days, the last of the last days. What could we be doing right now that would give us a greater opportunity to ensure that we would be a survivor of the last days? And to answer that, go to 2 Peter chapter 3. And Peter draws this inspired conclusion and gives us specific advice. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 11. Notice his comment. Since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, consider what sort of people you ought to be in holy acts of conduct and deeds of godly devotion. If we're going to survive, it's absolutely essential that we work on our conduct and our devotion. And think about what those taking the lead, what the governing body has provided to us. They've given us the tools not only to survive the last days, but to thrive. They've given us the tools right now in this intense period of time to come out of the last days stronger than we entered into them. As the end of this system rapidly approaches, the elements of Jesus' sign are not difficult to recognize. Such events can be seen by poets like Eliot, by physicists like Hawking. They can be seen by our neighbors and our coworkers. But where these men and others can recognize the tragic conditions of the last days, only Jehovah's people, only the anointed and their companions understand their significance. And Jesus explained why that's the case. Go back to Matthew 24, and this time, look at verse 33. Matthew 24, verse 33, a very simple but profound text. Notice what Jesus says. He says, likewise also you, when you, speaking of his followers, when you see all these things, the things that he just listed for us, know that he is near at the doors. Now, unlike people in general, Jesus' followers, we don't just see the sign, but we know what it means. We know that he's at the door. To survive the last days, in our condition needs to be one of obedience, one of readiness, one of preparedness, one of anticipation and zeal. That's why we refuse to subscribe to the thinking of some. Some say, well, when things get better, I'm going to do this. But when things turn around, I'm going to do that. Get better how? Turn around how? But we live in the last days. We're nearing the end of this system. We understand the sign and we know its significance. We can hear the knocking. We know that Jesus is near to the door. He's ready to take action. So the question is, are we thinking like people who know the end is near? Do we act like people who know the end is near? Do our plans reflect knowledge that the end is near? Understanding the elements of Jesus' prophecy should intensify our feelings of urgency, to use every moment that we can to strengthen our relationship with him and to help others to do the same. So we know what our condition and activity must be. And that really leaves just one thing of utmost importance to know and remember, if we're going to be a survivor of these last days. And it's the same thing that Jesus reminded his followers of when he said this to them in verse 14. If you're still open to Matthew 24, just go up to the end of verse 14. What does Jesus say? He said, then the end will come. That then the end will come, not with a whimper, not even with a bang, but with a refreshing, earth-shattering, system-changing roar, and that end is very near.